Started. Welcome, everyone, to New Hampshire Peace Action's Peace and Justice Conversation Series online. I'm Will Hopkins. I'm the director of New Hampshire Peace Action. In case you are new to our organization, New Hampshire Peace Action educates, mobilizes, and organizes to build a more peaceful and just future for all. We envisage a future where international relations are based on cooperation instead of competition and conflict, and where mutual benefit and shared security lead to a more peaceful and just global community. The corona pandemic spurred us to start this bi-weekly conversation series as a way to continue our public education work. And we found it so effective that we've decided to continue on indefinitely. This weekly online conversation series is intended to help us engage and sort out how to make the changes we've been yearning for. In that spirit of understanding and respect, we'd like to acknowledge that we are doing our work here on, if you'll just give me a moment. So we are doing our work here on the traditional ancestral homeland of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples, past and present. And we honor with gratitude the land and waterways that they have been stewarding throughout the generations. Tonight, we're bringing you Bruce Gagnon, who is, I'm excited to see again, it's been a while. He is the coordinator and a co-founder of the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space. He has been organizing since at least the early 80s, including the largest peace protest in the history of the state of Florida, where over 5,000 people attended. He's spoken all over the world about a number of peace-related issues and at a number of colleges and universities. He's also been featured by Rob Shetterly, who was our fall fundraiser speaker a few years back in his series, Americans Who Tell the Truth. He was an initiator of the Bring Our War Dollars Home campaign in Maine that has done work throughout New England on transferring money from wasteful Pentagon spending to supporting human needs here at home. And tonight, we're going to hear from Bruce about his trips to Russia and a little bit about the demonization of Russia that we've seen over the past few years. For those of you who are just joining us, this is a live streamed program and a recorded program. So if you're uncomfortable having your name or image on the internet, feel free to change your name and turn off your camera. So without wasting any more of your time, I'm going to turn it over to Bruce, who is going to tell us, is Russia really our enemy, Bruce?
Thank you, Will. And let me just say good evening to everyone and thank again New Hampshire Peace Action for the invitation. What I want to do tonight is shine a light on what the overall U.S. military strategy is today as it relates to Russia and that particular part of the world. But first, just a little bit about myself, my own background. I grew up in a military family, and in 1962, we were living at Ellsworth Air Force Base in South Dakota during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So I was crawling under my desk like most kids in those days. It was a B-52 bomber base, and it was on alert. My dad was gone for many days at a time. We weren't sure what was going to happen, but you can imagine at 10 years old, I was quite terrified at the situation. In 1968, we were living at Eglin Air Force Base in the panhandle of Florida, and I was the vice president of the Okaloosa County, Florida Young Republican Club, working on the Nixon campaign. And then after that, in 1971, moved to California, to Beale Air Force Base in Northern California, where I graduated from high school. And then I joined the Air Force in 1971 and was sent to Travis Air Force Base, also in Northern California. My first roommate was one of the organizers in the GI resistance movement. And so on the weekend, there would be protests right outside the gate. This is a picture from protests outside of Travis. And it is here that I became a peace activist. After getting out of the Air Force and going to college, quit just before I graduated to become an organizer with the United Farm Workers Union. And then in June 12th, 1982, I would say it was one of the most important days of my life. There was a huge protest in New York City during the UN special session on disarmament. They say almost 1 million people were there. I was watching it on C-SPAN from my home in Orlando, Florida. And after it was over, they cut away to a right-wing conference where the speaker was Ronald Reagan's head of SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative, or Star Wars. His name was Lieutenant General Daniel Graham. And during the Q&A after his speech, somebody said, General Graham, aren't you worried? They say there's almost 1 million people today in New York protesting against nuclear weapons. Aren't you worried about that? And he said, no, I think it's fantastic, because they're out there protesting against nuclear weapons and we're moving into space. They don't have a clue, he said. Let them keep doing what they're doing. And so it was in that moment that I began recognizing that I needed to, especially because I lived just in Orlando, an hour away from the Kennedy Space Center and Cape Canaveral Air Force Station, that I began organizing immediately to take people there repeatedly. Earlier, Will mentioned a protest with over 5,000 people. It was this one right here. It was called Cancel the Countdown. It was the first launch of a Trident II nuclear missile, a first flight test. And so we organized people from all over the country to come. And more than 200 people, led by Dr. Benjamin Spock, were arrested that day for trying to climb over the fence. So it was really at that point I began really focusing on the space program. Now, to talk about Ukraine and Russia. In the winter of 2013, 2014, I was paying a little bit of attention to the Ukraine situation, and I began following it literally daily, watching what they called the Maidan, the color revolution in the capital of Kiev that was happening. And I was really watching it on video. I was watching the pictures, reading articles, and followed it through the entire course of it. This film, this documentary, produced by Oliver Stone, is probably the best thing I've seen yet on the overall situation. I recommend everyone watch it. You can find it on my blog, which is called Organizing Notes. But to give a little background, the major force in this Maidan, in this so-called color revolution, were the Nazis who come from Western Ukraine. And during World War II, when Hitler invaded Russia or Soviet Union, he swept through Ukraine. And there was a Ukrainian nationalist by the name of Stefan Bandera. He put on a Nazi uniform and joined Hitler, and his forces joined Hitler, killing thousands of Jews, Poles, and other people in their country. And so today, the picture on the top right are people protesting today, loving the memory of Stefan Bandera and trying to reclaim his vision of essentially a Nazi Ukraine. And so during this Maidan, John McCain and other US politicians frequently came to encourage the so-called revolution. This guy speaking here is one of the leading Nazis of one of the Nazi death squads. And on the right, you see Victoria Nuland, who was Hillary Clinton's Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs. And just also not quite in the picture, but along with her is the US ambassador at the time to Ukraine, Obama's ambassador. His name was Jeffrey Piot. Victoria Nuland and Jeffrey Piot became famous for their call that was intercepted, where they said, F the EU. We don't care what the EU wants. We're going to put who we want in charge of this new government after the coup was over. And so, in fact, after the coup was over, this is the SBU headquarters in Kiev. the secret service, the secret police of Ukraine, you see the American flag flying alongside of the Ukrainian flag. I think that really tells us much of as to who was behind this coup and who was really going to benefit from it. The people of Ukraine, who are predominantly Russian ethnic people, were watching all of this madness going on at the Maidan in Kiev, where many, many people were killed. They said, we don't want anything to do with this. And so they immediately began organizing and demanded a referendum where everybody could vote. And so more than 85% of the people of Crimea voted by a 97% to say, we want to rejoin Russia. Because, you know, Crimea had been part of Russia since the 1780s when Catherine the Great took Crimea into the Russian Empire at that time. So on March 16th, 2014, just days after this so-called successful Maidan, what I call a US orchestrated coup in Kiev, the people of Russia voted, the people of Crimea voted to return to Russia, and Russia accepted them home. Let's look at this map. There's basically the blue area up near the Poland border is the area where the Nazis predominate today in Ukraine. That's the western part of Ukraine. The eastern part, the red part, you see Luhansk, Donetsk, Mariupol, and down below Crimea. These areas are the places where people are Russian ethnic people. They're right on the Russian border. They speak Russian. And then there's this middle area where it's a mixture of both. So this is an important thing to remember as we look at the dynamics that are happening in Ukraine today. One of the first things the new government did after this coup was to outlaw the speaking of Russian in Ukraine. Imagine that. And so the people in this eastern part of the country, in the red areas, began organizing petition campaigns and peaceful marches, which again, I was watching online on YouTube, and they were calling for a federated Ukraine, where they would have local autonomy within the Ukrainian government, and they would be allowed to speak Russian. They would be allowed to make local decisions that affected their lives. And immediately, these Nazi death squads were sent in by Kiev, and the new government of Kiev now was loaded with Nazis at the highest levels, security, intelligence, various layers of the government. And they sent these Nazis in to suppress these people who were doing these very legitimate democratic activities inside their country. This is another picture of one of these death squads. You see the European Union flag. The middle flag is the Azov battalion death squad flag, and then the Nazi symbol. And then on May 2nd, not long after this Maidan, this quote unquote successful Maidan, more of these people in the city of Odessa were gathering signatures on these petitions saying, we want a federated Ukraine, we want to be able to speak our language. And they were in front of this building called the Trades Hall that sits in the middle of a big park where lots of people walk through. And so they sent up tents to do like we call tabling to get people to sign these petitions. And they were attacked by hundreds and hundreds of Nazis that were bussed in by quote unquote unknown sources. And so what they did first was to burn the tents and the tabling areas. That's what you see the fire here. And the people that were doing the tabling ran inside the building. Again, I'm watching this in basically real time as this was unfolding before my eyes. Pictures show that people were making Molotov cocktails just outside, wearing the blue bandanas of the Ukrainian colors. And then again, people had run inside the building to protect themselves. But as the fires began to burn, as the Molotov cocktail smashed through windows, some people on the ground were shooting guns And so the people inside were choking on the smoke and came to the windows to try to get some air. And as they did that, again, they were shot at. And then in the left-hand bottom, you'll see maybe a bat or a steel rod sticking up. Maybe you see that. And on the right side, you'll see a couple helmets. There were people dressed in various kinds of gear, but so anyway, some of the people, because of the fire, actually dropped to the ground. And when they did, people with baseball bats and steel rods went over and started beating them to death. Somewhere between 50 to 200 people were killed. No one knows for sure because most of the bodies went missing. Police were photographed behind the building, but never interfered with any of this that was going on. They had to have been told to stand down. The fire trucks that tried to get there were blocked by the Nazis who were doing this on that occasion. And so the bodies that were taken away were some people alive, some people injured, some people dead, were never recovered. And many people, it was believed, that were taken to the dungeons of the new right-wing Kiev government. In May 2nd, 2016, the mothers of these disappeared held a rally. They wanted to go right up to the building and plant flowers, but the Azov battalion was guarding the building. The Nazi battalion was guarding the building and wouldn't let the thousands of people that came. Myself and two other Americans went there as an American delegation to be a part of this thing. As we were driven on a bus along with the mothers, Nazis along the side of the street were throwing rocks at the windows of the bus. But anyway, we ended up going there, but not able to get to the building. Soon, I learned from one of my friends, Regis Tremblay, who's pictured on the right in this picture here. He's from Maine. He now lives in Crimea. His son, who's in the U.S. Army Special Forces stationed in Colorado at Fort Carson, was sent to this base in Western Ukraine, the place where the Nazis predominate, in order to train the Nazis that were being taken to this place and then put into nice new American uniforms, because people were starting to talk about the Nazi death squads and they wanted to kind of dress them up and provide some cover for them. So this is actually a video. At the bottom, you see on the road, Ambassador Piot's trip to Kameletsky. Piot is, again, Obama's ambassador to Ukraine. He goes there. It's a video you can Google, on the road, Ambassador Piot, and watch it. He goes there and he talks about how NATO is building this state-of-the-art training center to train the Ukrainian forces. And then after that, they were sent off to eastern Ukraine, to the Russian border, to kill their fellow citizens, whose only crime was that they spoke Russian. They were ethnic Russian people. Here's a picture of some of these Ukrainians being trained. And you might notice some of these politicians. Starting in the middle, Lindsey Graham, a Republican from South Carolina. Next to him to the right, John McCain, Republican at that time from Arizona. Next to him, Senator Amy Klobuchar, Democrat from Minnesota. And next to her is Representative Marcy Kaptur, Democrat from Ohio. So it's clear to me that this is a bipartisan policy that we see unfolding today in Ukraine, supported by both parties. And one of the reasons I would submit to you for this situation that is happening today is that Russia and many European countries have banned GMO agriculture. And so Monsanto was able to get a law passed in Ukraine that now is requiring the Ukrainian government, which is essentially become a failed state because their economy has collapsed, in order for them to get money from the IMF and other international donors, they have to begin selling off their incredible soil to big agribusiness corporations like Monsanto. So seeing all this going on around me, I was really wanting to take people there, because even people in the peace movement, I was so distressed at how much they were swallowing this demonization of Russia. You know, it reminded me of the Iraq War in 2003. You remember all the demonization of and the lies about Saddam Hussein and the weapons of mass destruction, New York Times, Washington Post, MSNBC, CNN. Well, the same thing is happening here. And I'm saying, why are people swallowing this? Haven't they seen this movie before? And so I organized a group of 25 of our members and friends, an international group of Global Network supporters. And we went to Moscow, Crimea, and St. Petersburg in 2019. This is a picture of us meeting with Russian Veterans for Peace, which has been in existence for many, many years. They came and spoke to us at our hotel in Moscow, as did many other different kind of speakers that we arranged to hear from while we were there. This is a remarkable picture of a subway in Moscow. The subways are all beautiful and all decorated. But in many of them, you see wonderful monuments, I guess you'd say, to those that fought the Nazis and to workers, farmers. It's just really a beautiful situation. But all over the country, you see these honorings of the workers, the peasants. While we were in Moscow, we went to this amazing museum, the World War II museum. And I was really struck by this picture on the left, East meets West, a picture of an American and a Russian soldier. You know that the Russians suffered terribly during the Nazi invasion. 27 million people in the Soviet Union were killed at the hands of the Nazis. And so the Russians really wanted to be good friends with the Americans. But as soon as World War II was over, the nuclear bomb was exploded, in part as a warning to Russia that you better stand down or we will take you out. This picture on the right was an amazing thing. There were several rooms in this, huge rooms in this museum, where they had these massive paintings of life during the Nazi occupation. And this is one of the cities. I think it might be St. Petersburg, but I'm not certain. From Moscow, we went on to Crimea. We happened to be there on May Day. And so we were invited to participate in the May Day parade. We learned that in Crimea, the picture on the left, there are many, many, many different nationalities that are very much honored. And apparently they receive funding from the government to do cultural things. They really cherish the various differences amongst the people. So we had the honor of being in this parade and meeting some of these people. On the right, the Veterans for Peace flag being carried in this parade on May Day as well in Crimea. Following that parade, we were invited to this meeting of Crimean leaders. They spoke. They invited 4 of us to speak, and we shared our story. They shared their story. It was a really wonderful meeting. What we talked about a lot was building bridges between the peoples. From there, we went on to St. Petersburg, which is a glorious city, unbelievably beautiful. But there we learned that during the siege of Leningrad, as it was called during World War II, that the Nazis occupied the city of Leningrad, or St. Petersburg, for 872 days. So that's quite a long time. And during that time, 650,000 people died of starvation at the hands of the Nazis. So this place here is a huge mass grave where you see each of these stones has a year of when these people died. It's just a really, really gripping memorial to the people. As it turned out, we were there on May 9th in St. Petersburg, which is Victory Day, the day they celebrate the defeat of the Nazis. Again, the Russians played an instrumental role In the last couple of years, every year on the days of remembering the end of World War II, the European powers, the Brits, the French, the Americans, they go to France, to Normandy, and celebrate the invasion against the Nazis. But in the last 2 years, they didn't even invite the Russians to be a part of that. This demonization has gone that far that history is being rewritten to essentially take out the contributions of the Russian people in the end of World War II. So in this parade, people carry the photos of their relatives who fought and or died during World War II. And they invited us to do the same. On the left is a picture of me carrying a picture of two of my uncles who were in the Navy during World War II, both of whom were on ships that were sunk by the Nazis. And several other people in our delegation also carried pictures of our relatives who fought against the Nazis in World War II. We were told that there were more than 1 million people in this parade. It went on for literally hours. And the remarkable thing was, walking back the opposite direction to get back to our hotel afterwards, I was counting pieces of trash that I found on the road after more than 1 million people walked by. And I saw about 3 or 4 pieces of trash. Just told me something about the people of Russia. In October of 2019, I was invited by a labor leader in Lugansk to come to Lugansk and Donetsk in the Donbass, in the region right along the Russian border, the Ukrainian part of the Russian-speaking area. And so I went there. And this is just a picture of one of the housing blocks in Lugansk that has been hit repeatedly by artillery shells. And on the right is just one place where names of people that have been killed by these Nazi death squads and now by the Ukrainian army since 2014. 14,000 people have been killed in the Donbass at the hands of the Ukrainian government. While I was in Lugansk, they took us to this bridge. I was there with a couple of other international people, and they took us to this bridge that is a link between Lugansk over a river to where people have to go, Ukrainians have to go to pick up their pensions. And so the Nazis blew the bridge up in the middle of it so that now the people had to go on these makeshift ways, mostly elderly people, some of them disabled, having to crawl on these, really rickety wooden staircases to get through this middle section of the bridge where it had been destroyed. Just the Ukrainians doing everything they could to make life just unbearable for the people in the Donbass. All, again, supported, funded, directed by the United States. This is Donetsk, the other big city in the Donbass, another apartment block that has been shelled and now is abandoned because people couldn't afford to live there. And this is right on the edge of the city, a huge city with a large population and one of the largest cities in all of Ukraine. And people are moved out of one whole area. Well, at the instigation of France, Germany, Russia, and Belarus, Ukraine was forced against its own will to come to negotiations to reach a settlement that would in fact create a federated Ukraine, that would allow the Donbass region to stay as Ukrainians. We hear all the time that they're Russian separatists in Donbass. Really, all they wanted was to be a part of Ukraine, but to be respected and honored, as citizens. And so these Minsk agreements said, okay, Ukraine must create a federated country. They must allow people to speak Russian. They must give them certain local rights, and they must pull back their their death squads and their army away from this contact line in the Donbass, where they're continually, since 2014, for 7 years now, shelling the people. But the problem was that that the Minsk agreements were never agreed to. Even though they were signed by Ukraine, Ukraine never honored these agreements to this very day. Germany has been moving away from coal and oil to natural gas. And as a result of that, they need more sources of fuel as they're developing their alternative technologies like solar and wind and other things like that. They wanted to get Russian natural gas. But the United States didn't like the idea of a pipeline being built under the sea from Russia to Germany. So the United States has been doing everything in its power to disrupt this pipeline. And so many of these provocations against Russia, many of these demonizations against Russia, is to try to stop Germany and Europeans from buying natural gas from Russia. Instead, the United States is recommending that those countries buy liquefied natural gas, frack gas, from the US that would be shipped on tankers across the ocean at a much higher expense. But this is what we see, one of the tensions going on today. So let's get a little more detailed into this. Why is Russia really truly being demonized? At the top of this document, you see the Rand Corporation logo. This is a Rand Corporation study that calls for the balkanization or the breakup of Russia into smaller countries. The reason being that because of climate crisis and the melting of the Arctic ice, the Western oil corporations want access to the Arctic so they can drill, baby, drill. And as it turns out, Russia has the largest land border with the Arctic of any country on the planet. And so the Western oil corporations, as this Rand Corporation study lays out, wants to go in and break Russia up into constituent countries, making it easier for these oil corporations to have access to this massive land border. Well, after the fall of the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, at the time George Herbert Walker Bush was president, his Secretary of State, Jim Baker, made a deal with Gorbachev of the Soviet Union that NATO would not expand 1 inch towards Russia. This was an agreement that had to be made in order to get the former Soviet Union to agree to the reunification of Germany. And so the Soviet Union was promised that NATO would not expand. And so as a result of that, the Soviet Union disbanded, remember, their Warsaw Pact, Eastern European alliance. They got rid of it completely, saying we don't need it anymore. We've been promised by the US, by NATO, that it won't expand. Everything should be fine. Well, Bill Clinton broke the promise when he was president, began what he called NATO enlargement. And so today we see NATO is on steroids. These dark blue colors on the left showing how NATO has expanded right up virtually to the Russian border. And now is holding war games annually. The one on the right, Anaconda, that's 2016, a war game that was going on in Poland that the US and NATO were running. This document on the left is a US military document showing the various forces, the war games that they've been holding, again, right up in this eastern part of Europe, very near the Russian border. And the one on the right showing US war games up in the Nordic region, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Finland. Picture on the left is Norway, a NATO war game there. And what we've learned is the US has created a weapons hub in Norway, right near the Russian border, because Norway has a border with Russia, where after these war games are over, they leave a lot of this heavy equipment there at this weapons depot for future use. And the picture on the right is Poland, when US NATO hold war games on the Poland side, the Eastern European side, near the Russian border. The US has created a base in Poland where they're leaving these heavy equipment as well for future use. Oops. So when Russia sees this happening right along their border, and they hold military exercises in their own country near the Ukrainian border, they're accused by the United States and NATO of being aggressive. But how else can you imagine Russia should be expected to react when the US and NATO are expanding and holding war games on virtually every side, every corner of the Russian Federation? Now I want to talk about the connections of this new Space Force to Russia. The US has created a NATO Space Force base at Ramstein Air Force Base in Germany, which is the headquarters of much of these operations that are now happening throughout Eastern Europe. This is a document some of you might be familiar with, Vision for 2020. This says the US will control space, dominate space, and deny other countries access to space on behalf of corporate interests around the world. You might know that following World War II, the US smuggled 1,500 primary Nazi operatives into the US in a program called Operation Paperclip. Among them were Wernher von Braun in the middle of this picture, the famous rocket scientist who was brought to the US to create the US space program. He was running the Hitler program. And this was his liaison. This is Major General Walter Dornberger, Hitler's liaison to von Braun, ensuring that von Braun had everything he needed whenever he needed more money or more slaves inside a mountain tunnel called Dora, where Jews and Gypsies and French resistance fighters were used to build the V-1 and V-2 rockets. Von Braun would just ask Dornberger for more slaves, and they would be given to him along with more money. Dornberger came to the US also as part of Operation Paperclip, and in 1950 became vice president of Bell Aviation Aerospace. And in 1958, he testified before the United States Congress saying, "Gentlemen, I didn't come to this country to lose the Third World War. I lost 2 already." And he talked about the United States needs to have orbiting battle stations above the planet, controlling who can get on and off the planet Earth. So 100 copies of the V-1, or excuse me, the V-2 rocket were brought to the US after the end of the war. And they were brought along with 100 of these former Nazi engineers and rocket scientists, first to White Sands, New Mexico, and then to Huntsville, Alabama, to Redstone Arsenal to create the US space program. This is a picture of von Braun with his Nazi friends and his American military overseer as they undertook this program to create the US space program. This is a picture of the Space Command headquarters in Colorado, Master of Space. I ask you, what's the difference between the slogan, Master of Space, and the Nazi slogan, Deutschland über alles? We know that whoever controls space will be able to see everything on the planet, will be able to hear everything on the planet, and be able to target every place on the planet. And so today, all US military operations, whether they're troops on the ground, people in tanks, Humvees, on ships, on airplanes, all coordinated by space technology. And the US has set up bases all over the world that are called downlink bases that communicate with orbiting military satellites, relay signals to places like Buckley Air Force Base in Colorado, a key receiving station for US military technology. I just want to talk briefly about one aspect of space warfare. It's called missile defense. You might have heard of it. The idea is a shield. Think of a shield. US launches a first strike attack on Russia or China, tries to take out their nuclear capability, whether it's land-based, air-based, sea-based. They try to take it out in a first strike attack. But inevitably, the United States doesn't get all of it. And so Russia or China then fire a retaliatory strike. It is then that so-called missile defense, the shield, would be used to take out any remaining retaliatory capability, giving the US a quote-unquote successful first strike attack. Now, there are various aspects. The one on the left, boost or ascent segment. This is to try to hit a missile soon after it's launched. When it's slow, it's easy to detect because the exhaust is coming out of the tail end of it. You can see it, easier to hit. And as it turns out, this particular missile defense program has the best testing results so far. The middle one, mid-course, this is where you try to have a bullet hit a bullet in deep space when it's traveling at 15,000 miles an hour, could release decoys. This system will never work. And then terminal, the PAC-3, the THAAD, and again, the Aegis warships with these same SM-3 interceptor missiles on board could try to hit a missile in its descent phase. These systems on the left and the systems on the right are being deployed today to encircle both Russia and China. I must add that both Russia and China for years have said they would never launch a first strike attack. They've renounced it. The United States refuses to do so. So where I live here in Bath, Maine, these Navy Aegis destroyers are built with these so-called missile defense interceptors on board. In addition, these Aegis destroyers can also fire Tomahawk first strike attack cruise missiles. And because they've had the best testing results so far, the military has decided, let's deploy the Aegis launch system that is on board the ships. Let's put it on land, and we'll call it Aegis Ashore. And so today, a Aegis Ashore launch facility has been built in Romania, very near the Russian border, built by the US Army Corps of Engineers. And in addition, one is now underway being constructed in Poland. And both of these facilities then would be able to launch after a US first strike attack, very close to the Russian border. They would be able to try to take out Russian nuclear retaliatory responses after a US first strike attack. And they would be able to hit them in the boost phase because they would be close enough to hit them soon after they were launched. As they were slow, as exhaust was coming from their tail, easily detected, much easier to hit and destroy. And from this same launch platform then in Romania and Poland, Tomahawk cruise missiles, first strike attack weapons, nuclear capable, would also be able to be fired. You just hit a switch, change the launch device on it, and you can fire either the missile defense shield interceptors or the Tomahawk cruise missile first strike attack weapons. They could reach Moscow, they could reach various command control sites inside of Russia. And so I ask you, dear friends, how is Russia to respond? It's the Cuban Missile Crisis in reverse, except this time the American people know virtually nothing about it at all. But right upon their borders, the United States is positioning all of these military ways of waging war on Russia. And how is Russia to respond? This is what we essentially are doing today. I would submit to you, the evidence is overwhelming. It's overwhelming. And again, the American people know virtually nothing about it. One thing I want to say, that many of my dear friends, rightly so, have been lately celebrating the nuclear ban, where countries have declared, enough countries have now declared that nuclear weapons should be banned, they're illegal. But many of those same friends do not yet understand, it appears to me, that the place where nuclear war could begin today, World War III, is on the Russian border and the Chinese border. I haven't gone through China at all, but these very same things are happening. Everything I've spelled out, the war games, expanding NATO, NATO's expanding into the Asia Pacific, missile defense deployments encircling China, the same things are happening to China as they're happening to Russia today. So I ask you, dear friends, who actually is the aggressor? You've all heard of SIPRI. Look at the bottom, Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. They annually do these calculations. This is the 2018 figure. You see the United States, 36% of the world total in military spending. I want you to look over to the right column. 1, 2, 3, 4, fifth. Fifth number down, Russia, 3.4%. And the last 2 years, Putin cut the military budget in Russia because he said there was too much poverty. They needed to increase social spending. So it's actually even less than 3.4% now. I don't know how much less. But is it possible that at 3.4% of the global total, the equivalence of France, that Russia is going to attack Europe as it's continually being accused of wanting to do and to take over Europe? It's a lark. It's propaganda. And again, so many people are swallowing it. And if you go down that column, add up France, United Kingdom, Germany, Japan, South Korea, Italy, Australia, Canada, Turkey, either NATO members or NATO partners. They have this new thing called NATO partnership. So you add all those up to the US total, it's 60% of the world total against Russia at 3.4%? No, hardly believable at all. So I'm through that in record time. I'll stop there, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions. Thank you very much for listening. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Bruce. Folks, we've got a lot of folks on the chat. So the way I'd like to do the Q&A is you can either post your questions in the chat and I'll read them aloud, or you can post an asterisk in the chat and I will recognize you so that you can ask your own question. And I'd love to kick us off, Bruce, by you mentioned that Russia has a no first use policy, and that is something that I did not know. Is there a place we can find out more about that? Because that's I knew China had an official no first use policy, but I hadn't heard the same about Russia.
I'm sure that if you just search for it on the internet, it'll be easily found. I can't tell you, go to XYZ spot. Russia has said that if they were attacked by nuclear weapons, they would indeed retaliate. Putin has said, and this is a direct quote, what kind of world would it be without Russia?
Don't be shy, folks. Go ahead and either post your questions in the chat, or we've got a few, it's quite a bit there, or post an asterisk if you want to be recognized. And I don't know, Amy, have you been watching the chat? Are there questions there to?
There are.
Okay. So moving up, I see one from Jim. It says, what I remember from years ago was after the Soviet Union ended, Boris Yeltsin was in charge and Lawrence Summers came in to help with the economy. Summers wanted a no regulations, free market economy, which resulted in a terrible economy and gave rise to Putin. How accurate is what I learned before? Thanks.
Exactly. They call it the Harvard Boys. They were sent in to essentially privatize Russia, get rid of communism, get rid of state ownership. They created chaos. The death rate increased dramatically, and so Yeltsin was an alcoholic. He was a puppet of the United States, and the country was everything that the United States wanted. Then Yeltsin left, and he picked this young guy that nobody knew, named Vladimir Putin, who was a respected bureaucrat in St. Petersburg, where he was from. And he was known for being honest and very direct, not corruptible. The story was he didn't take bribes. He was made sort of an interim president. They didn't expect he'd be there long. And the first thing he did was to hold a meeting with a lot of the leading oligarchs who had benefited from this privatization. They were buying up various industries in Russia. And he met with them and he said, you're going to pay people fairly. You're going to treat the workers fairly. You're going to take good care of them. And if you don't, I'm going to have a problem with you. If you do treat them well, we won't have a problem. Some of the oligarchs began saying, who the hell are you to tell us that? We're rich now. We'll do whatever we want. And so Putin prosecuted them for various crimes. And they then began this first series of calling Putin this horrible dictator that blah, blah, blah. The Russian people actually have consistently voted for Putin over and over again because he brought great stability to Russia. He's rebuilt their economy dramatically and returned their sense of pride. And they have a very long, rich, beautiful culture in their country. They're very proud of it. And they were very embarrassed and sad and just depressed over the collapse of the Soviet Union and the destruction of their economy and everything else. So they really are very fond of Putin today.
All right. Michael Hoey asks, could you talk more about the incorporation of former Nazis, such as Reinhard Gehlen, into the U.S. military, intelligence, and industrial complex?
Reinhard Gehlen is very important. He was Major General, Hitler's head of intelligence in the Eastern Europe up to the Russian border as Hitler was invading the Soviet Union. He was brought to the US by Allen Dulles, who created the CIA. He was made after the reunification of Germany. Imagine West Germany now, this new country, this reunified Germany rather. Their first head of their intelligence was Reinhard Gehlen, the former Nazi. Can you imagine that? Why was he made a former Nazi? Because the U.S. wanted him in there. Gehlen, his story to the U.S. was, I have a rat line of fascists throughout Eastern Europe, right up to the Russian border. Guys like Stefan Bandera that I talked about early on from Western Ukraine, this Nazi sympathizer. So Gehlen said, if you bring me into the CIA, I'll share my rat line with you, and we'll use that to destabilize the former Soviet Union. And this is one reason why Stalin was so paranoid and was, killing his own people and everything else, because he knew that this rat line was put into operation on behalf of the U.S. following World War II. And Reinhard Gehlen was the guy that made it all possible.
Next question from Will Thomas, our state coordinator of Vets for Peace. Will asks, Bruce, have you actually sent some of these documents to our U.S. senators and asked them to respond to what the U.S. is doing to encircle Russia and China militarily? And if the corporate media is aware of what the U.S. is doing, is that proof that there really is a military, industrial, congressional media complex?
Well, the second question first, of course, absolutely. Eisenhower was right. Uh, we have a corporate dominated media. I've seen the change just in the last 25 years. Used to be I could get on CBS News. I'd be driving down the road in Orlando, Florida on some of my space protests. I could hear myself interviewed on CBS News. But today, those days are long gone. We can't get on any mainstream media anymore. We rely on alternative media and Zoom webinars. So have I sent these documents to politicians? Frankly, I don't waste my time with people in the Capitol in Washington because they're immune to it. Even my liberal Democrat Congresswoman, Shelley Pingree from Maine, she's on her knees asking for more money for these Navy Aegis destroyers all the time. They don't want to talk to us. They don't want to hear from us. So I spend all my time talking to the people, trying to organize and educate the people so they understand what's really going on.
And I'd love to just insert another one of my own questions, and they're coming in on the chat pretty quickly now. But I would love to hear a little bit. So our media really focused in on Russiagate for the last 4 years, give or take. This idea that Russia and Russian intelligence meddled in the 2016 presidential election. What do you think? It's been really amazing to me because I think peace activists usually run in what we might call liberal circles, and most people who define as liberals tended to really focus on that and believe that even after we knew that that really it amounted to a few $1,000s in Facebook ads from Russian IP addresses. Can you talk a little bit about Russiagate and how it became so forward in our media and in our discourse?
Well, first of all, I want to say that as far as I'm concerned, there's never been any real evidence of Russia hacking Russia, messing with our elections, any of that stuff. And where I get my firm belief of that is from VIPS, VIPS, Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity. People like Ray McGovern, who was a former CIA analyst, briefed a series of US presidents, the daily briefing, various NSA, CIA, FBI people who have created an organization. If you go to Consortium News website, you'll see all the time their writings, Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity. They've all studied this hacking thing repeatedly. One of the, Benny is his name. I can't think of his first name, but Benny, one of the leading NSA guys, studied the whole Democrat files, documents, hacking that Russia's accused of, said it never happened. Russia didn't do it. It was downloaded on a disk by someone from the inside. So anyway, I think they really clearly put that to rest. Aaron Matei, who many of you know, a good progressive journalist, has done absolute wonderful journalism on this whole story and has also put it to rest. In the end, the Russians understand that having Trump or Biden or Obama doesn't make a big difference. Putin keeps saying the United States is treaty averse. The United States is pulling out of all the treaties, the ABM treaty that used to outlaw missile defense. George W. Bush pulled out of it, and a whole slew of treaties since that time the U.S. is pulling out of. Why? Because the U.S. doesn't want any restrictions on its ability to control and dominate, whether it's in space or on the earth below. And so I think this is the story. This is what's happening today.
Next question from Richard Fersman. What about the darker side of Russian history? Stalin's participation in invading Poland, mass starvation of Ukrainians in 1932 and 1933, Nazi scientists captured and working with the Soviet Union, neo-Nazi groups that exist in Russia, poisoning of opposition, disappearance of reports, and more?
Well, it's a lot to unpack in that suitcase. But let me just say, I'm not a defender of Stalin, and I'm not trying to, but I do want to remind people again that when Reinhard Gehlen, Hitler's military intelligence guy, joins with the United States and is essentially re-engaging his rat line of fascists throughout Eastern Europe, Stalin's going to be a little bit paranoid, and everybody after him, not just Stalin, okay? But sure, Stalin did some bad things. There's no doubt about it. And even, if you read about Khrushchev, he laid it all out during his time in power. He disclosed to the Russian people that Stalin had done many of these terrible crimes. So even during the Soviet Union, it was acknowledged that this was done and this was a real problem. I don't buy the whole poisoning shtick. We keep hearing about Navalny in jail, but we don't hear about what the United States and the United Kingdom are doing to Julian Assange today, for example, who many believe is extremely ill and could very well die in that UK prison. So I don't buy it. I think it's more propaganda from the West, but people can make up their own mind about those kind of things themselves.
Well, unfortunately, we have gone past 8 o'clock, and that is our cutoff, and so we are out of time. But Bruce, thank you so much for being with us, sharing the stories of your trips to Russia and all of your research on U.S.-Russia policy. Thank you all for joining us and being with us tonight. You may note that this is a free program to everyone, and we keep it that way by through donations. So if you feel so inclined, feel free to visit our website and check out our donate tab, and also you can see all of our prior live streams. For our next few Mondays, it's every other Monday, we have Michael Ferber on April 26th. He'll be talking about nonviolent theory and action. On May 10th, we'll have Fawn Gaudet and Catherine Safitkas, who are going to talk about the war on bees and agriculture. And on May 24th, you can join us to hear Griffin Sinclair Wingate, a former NHPA youth, who will talk to us about organizing through a multi-generational lens. I see that Norma has asked, can we get a taping of this show? And it will be available on YouTube or Facebook, or you can check it out on the New Hampshire Peace Action website under our live stream tab. So with that, I'm going to say again, thank you, Bruce, for being with us. Thank you, everyone, for being with us, and have a great night.
Thank you very much.
You